paper starts with and circulates around a notorious and widely reported social psychology study by a team from the Universities of Virginia and Harvard, led by Tim Wilson, published in the journal Science in 2014. And the title of their study was innocuous enough: Just Think: The Challenges of the Disengaged Mind. And the logic is that given the abundance of electronic devices and screens constantly surrounding us, the rationale of the study was to see the effect of removing them and consequently of leaving research subjects alone with their thoughts for a substantial and specified time period. But sensationalist headlines in the media, including reputable outlets such as the BBC, Wired and Forbes, claimed that subjects would rather shock themselves to induce pain rather than experience boredom. So my paper uses this study as an opportunity to historicize the distinct and successive ways that nervous pathways and effective and motor functions of pain have been diagrammed within the body, up to and including the neuroscientific model that forms the basis for Wilson's discussion. Left alone without screens or outward distractions, our inwardly directed thought is known in neuroscience literature as default mode processing or default mode network (DMN) activity. But over the course of the paper, I discuss how the history of physiological investigations into pain and sensation offers the means to diagram pain and sensation beyond the boundaries of the individual body, to consider the broader milieu of the organism and its environment. The article is structured around the following four somewhat interrelated claims. First, in terms of laboratory-based experimentation and self-experimentation with pain, there's a long history of regarding pain and touch through introspective means, a practice which attained scientific credibility in the 19th century through such experimental physiologists as Claude Bernard and Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard in France, Johannes Müller, Ernst Weber, Gustav Fechner and Alfred Goldstein in Germany, and Magnus Blix in Sweden, the latter two independently conducting similar experiments on the perceptual thresholds of touch and temperature to test Müller's theory of specific nerve energies. Second, pain and other bodily sensations become measurable in the mid-19th and early 20th centuries through the use of instruments and technologies that first demarcate, then inscribe, an introspectively sensible difference, or limen. Through the pioneers in psychophysics, Weber, Fechner, and onwards, the wide variability of subjective pain experiences was no barrier to the desirability to establish correspondences across and between human subjects. Thus it was the differences in felt intensities themselves which were measured, then rendered visible as objects of study. The story of Weber's and Fechner's just noticeable difference, or JND, is partly the familiar story of machines of observation that capture vital processes and transfigure them as visible traces or representations in modernity, the standard ideas of Crary and Danius and brain, for example. And these instruments of measuring touch and pain sensitivity were used as the basis for establishing baselines of deviance, for example with the criminologist Cesare Lombroso. Third, taking the idea of measurable intensities forwards, I briefly consider the nervous system as itself part of a larger homeostatic system of, quote, effective motivational information, in the words of Hardcastle. Consequently, I consider another perspective which has long been present within the history of science, based on the role of pain and sensation in the organism as an homeostatic entity. This perspective encompasses the 19th century concept of the milieu intérieur from Claude Bernard, the early 20th century physiologist Charles Sherrington, and the neurologist Kurt Goldstein, and aggregates into another approach to pain explored by 21st century neuroscientist A.D. Bud Craig. Here, pain is less about circuits, electrical systems or measurable signals, and more about thresholds of difference, the perception of intensity, and the motivation of the organism as a whole. So fourth, Wilson's study of pain through autostimulation might be considered as a manifestation of the aliveness that results from what Scary calls the, quote, felt experience of sentience, end quote. In other words, it's part of the nature of default mode processing that the roiling fizz and buzz of peripheral nerve states distributed throughout the body become dampened and homogenized to stable background states. Considering how pain is simultaneously an intra-organismic sequence of responses that tips the organism as a whole from perception to action, but also operates beyond the organism as a biopsychosocial phenomenon.